Before there was law, before there was religion, before there was a king seated on a throne or a priest standing at an altar, there was a garden. And in that garden, coiled around the branch of a tree unlike any other, was a serpent. Most people have heard this story. Most people think they know it. They were told the serpent was the villain, the embodiment of evil, the deceiver, the creature that whispered ruin into the ear of a woman and brought destruction upon the entire human race. But what if that version of the story was written by the winners? What if the oldest question in human history, was the serpent evil or enlightened, has never truly been answered? What if the being standing at the foot of that tree was not a destroyer, but the very first liberator mankind ever had? That question is not new. Theologians have wrestled with it for 2,000 years. Gnostic sects were persecuted and burned for answering it the wrong way. Ancient civilizations left clues in clay tablets and carved stone that suggest the story was far older and far more complicated than the version passed down to us. And today, scholars from fields as different as comparative mythology, neuroscience, ancient history, and philosophy are all circling back to that same forbidden tree and asking the same question with fresh eyes. Was the serpent in Eden the first liberator of mankind? The answer, when you follow it all the way down, is one of the most profound and dangerous ideas in the entire history of human thought. To understand the serpent, you have to understand what Eden actually was. The word itself comes from the Sumerian word Eden, meaning a steppe or plain, not a paradise in the lush, romantic sense that painters and poets imagined, but a controlled enclosure, a managed space. The ancient Hebrew word gan, translated as garden, referred to a walled or fenced area, not an open field, but a contained one. God, in the Genesis account, places the human being inside this enclosure and gives a single instruction with enormous weight. You may eat of every tree in this garden except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Touch it, and you will die. Now consider what that instruction actually means. A being with the power to create the entire universe, who shaped the stars and separated the seas, who breathed life into dust. That being's one concern, the one boundary drawn in the entire cosmos, was that human beings must not know the difference between good and evil. Must not know. Not that they would become dangerous, not that the knowledge would corrupt them in some technical sense. The prohibition was about awareness itself, about the capacity to judge, to discern, to evaluate reality from a position of informed consciousness. And here is where the serpent enters, and where everything begins to shift. The serpent, as described in Genesis 3:1, was the most cunning of all the creatures God had made. This detail is important. It was not a demon. It was not an outside force. It was one of God's own creations, described with a word in Hebrew, aram, that translates as shrewd, wise, or perceptive. The same word is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, to praise human wisdom. The serpent approaches the woman and asks a question, not a command, not a temptation in the crude sense, a question. Did God really say you must not eat of any tree in the garden? And from that question, a conversation unfolds that changes everything. The woman explains the prohibition. The serpent responds with something extraordinary. It tells her that God knows that on the day she eats from that tree, her eyes will be opened and she will become like God, knowing good and evil. Read that carefully. The serpent does not say the fruit will make her powerful or rich or immortal. It says it will make her knowing. And then crucially, the text confirms that the serpent was telling the truth. When God discovers what has happened, the divine response is not they have sinned or they have been deceived. The response is this: the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. God confirms it. The serpent's promise was accurate. This is the detail that has haunted theologians for millennia. If the serpent lied, the story is simple. A deceiver tricks the innocent and humanity falls. But the serpent did not lie. The serpent told the woman the exact truth about what the fruit would do, and that truth was that she would gain the very thing that makes a being divine, the ability to know good from evil. So the question must be asked again and asked honestly, what kind of liberation is that? And what does it say about the one who withheld it? In ancient Sumer, thousands of years before the Hebrew Bible took shape, two brother deities dominated the divine order, Enlil and Enki. Enlil was the lord of wind and storm, the supreme authority figure, the god who decreed the fates of gods and men alike. He was orderly, authoritarian, and deeply concerned with control. Enki was something else entirely. Enki was the god of wisdom, of fresh waters, of magic, of craft, of healing, and of human beings. In Sumerian iconography, Enki was consistently depicted with serpentine symbols. The caduceus, two serpents intertwined around a staff, was associated with his domain long before it became a symbol of medicine. Enki was, in the oldest known written tradition in human history, the serpent god who sided with humanity against the will of the divine council. The parallels between Enki and the Genesis serpent are not vague or coincidental. In the Mesopotamian flood narrative, which predates the biblical flood story, it is Enki who reveals the god's secret plan to destroy humanity by warning his mortal protege, allowing the human race to survive. Against the direct orders of Enlil, the supreme authority, Enki chooses humanity. He is the god who gives knowledge to people that the other gods would prefer they not have. He is the divine being who defies the council of heaven to protect and empower the creatures below, and he is symbolized always by the serpent. When the Hebrew writers composed Genesis, they were working within a cultural world saturated with these Sumerian and Babylonian myths. The figure they cast as villain, the serpent, the cunning one, the knowledge giver, bears an unmistakable resemblance to the figure Sumerian mythology cast as humanity's greatest champion. What changed was not the character. What changed was who was telling the story and what they needed that story to do. This brings us to one of the most radical theological movements in all of ancient history, Gnosticism. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a collection of religious sects emerged across Egypt, Syria, and the wider Roman world that looked at the Genesis story and read it in exactly the opposite direction from Orthodox Christianity. These groups, the Ophites, the Nassanes, the Scythians, the Cainites, were branded heretics by the Church Fathers and systematically suppressed. But their ideas survived, preserved in hostile accounts written by the very people who condemned them, and eventually in the Nag Hammadi texts, a library of Gnostic scriptures buried in the Egyptian desert around 400 CE and discovered by a farmer in 1945. The Ophites took their name from the Greek word ophis, meaning serpent. For them, the serpent in Eden was not a devil, it was a divine emissary, a being sent into the garden specifically to wake up humanity and offer them something the Creator had deliberately denied them. Their theology rested on a crucial distinction that transformed the entire moral architecture of the Genesis story. The God of Genesis, they argued, was not the highest God. The God of Genesis was a lesser being, called the demiurge, the craftsman, who had created the physical world and placed human beings inside it as a kind of property. This God was not all-knowing or all-good. This God was jealous, controlling, and afraid of what humanity might become if they were ever truly awakened. Above this demiurge, in Gnostic cosmology, existed the true God, infinite, unknowable, a pure source of light and spirit untainted by the crude mechanics of physical creation. And the serpent in Eden, according to the Ophites, was an agent of that higher reality. When it offered Eve the fruit of knowledge, it was not tempting her towards sin. It was offering her the first genuine act of grace any divine being had ever extended to a human, the gift of gnosis, of true knowing, of awareness that she was more than what her jailer had told her she was. Britannica's entry on the Ophites captures their position with precision. They regarded the serpent as a true liberator of mankind, because it first taught human beings to rebel against their oppressor and seek knowledge of the actual, ultimate God that the demiurge had been hiding from them. The Ophite reading of Eden is not a reading of human failure. It is a reading of human awakening. The first moment a created being looked past the authority claiming dominion over her and chose consciousness over compliance. The Nassanes, a closely related sect whose name derived from the Hebrew nachash, serpent, developed a sophisticated philosophical and allegorical theology around the same insight. Their texts, preserved in Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies, interpreted the Genesis serpent as a mediator of divine wisdom, a figure analogous to the Logos, the divine principle of reason and meaning that runs through all things. For the Nassanes, the serpent was not an animal and not a devil. It was a cosmic principle, the principle of transformation, of rising from ignorance into knowledge, of the soul ascending from its trapped material condition toward the light of genuine spiritual understanding. What the Gnostics grasped, and what mainstream theology worked very hard to suppress, was a question of power. Who benefits from a humanity that does not know good from evil? Who benefits from people who cannot judge their own condition? Who accept the boundaries placed around them as natural and holy? Who never question whether the authority claiming to rule them is legitimate? The Eden story, read through Gnostic eyes, is not primarily about sin. It is about epistemology, about who controls what people are allowed to know and what happens to the system of power when that control breaks down. Now come the Greeks, because no exploration of this question is complete without them. On the other side of the Mediterranean, a civilization that had never read Genesis was working through an almost identical story using different characters and different names. Prometheus was a Titan, one of the elder beings who preceded the Olympian gods. When Zeus and the Olympians created human beings, they made them weak and ignorant, and without fire, without technology, unable to cook food or see in the darkness or warm themselves against the cold. They were, in a very specific sense, kept in a state of managed helplessness. The structural resemblance to Eden is almost perfect. A divine authority keeps humanity in a state of deliberate limitation. A being with access to something greater, fire, knowledge, makes the choice to give it to human beings against the explicit will of the ruling power. That being is punished catastrophically, and humanity is changed forever. The Greek mythological tradition cast Prometheus as a hero without reservation. Aeschylus wrote his tragedy, Prometheus bound, and to explore the moral implications of this act, and the adjective philanthropos, lover of humanity, was first applied to Prometheus in that play. The same word was later applied to Jesus in early Greek hymns. The comparison was not accidental. Scholars of comparative religion have long noted that whether you are reading about Prometheus stealing fire, the Genesis serpent offering fruit, or the Sumerian Enki revealing divine secrets to his mortal protege, you are reading the same story. It is the story of a being who chooses humanity over authority, who pays a price for that choice, and who changes the trajectory of human existence in the process. Every culture that told this story told it from the perspective of the ruling power. Prometheus is punished, the serpent is cursed, Enki is exiled. But in each case, the human beings who received the gift were irreversibly transformed. They became something the gods had not intended. They became conscious. And this brings us to perhaps the most quietly revolutionary dimension of this entire question. What actually happened to Adam and Eve the moment they ate? The text says their eyes were opened. They became aware. They looked at themselves and knew for the first time that they were naked. This detail is usually read as a story about shame, but the Hebrew word used for their realization is not about shame in the moral sense. It is about self-perception. They saw themselves as objects in a world, as selves with bodies and identities. They gained, in the language of modern philosophy, subjectivity. They became beings who experienced their own existence from the inside. And that, in the most literal sense, is the definition of consciousness. Before the fruit, Adam and Eve had no moral agency. They could not distinguish good from evil, which means they could not choose between them, which means they could not truly choose anything. They were, in philosophical terms, not yet free. The fruit did not corrupt them. It made them real. It made them the kind of beings who could be morally responsible for their actions, who could love in a meaningful sense, who could suffer and understand why they were suffering. If humanity's dignity consists in our capacity for reason, moral judgment, and self-awareness, all the things that separate us from other animals and make us capable of ethics, art, law, and love, then the moment Eve bit into that fruit was not the moment humanity fell. It was the moment humanity began. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel saw the Eden story in exactly this light. For Hegel, the fall was not a tragedy. It was a necessary and progressive moment in the development of human consciousness. The state of innocent, unreflective union with nature that Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fruit was not a superior state. It was a prior state, a preliminary one, equivalent to the unconscious contentment of an animal. Real human freedom, real human spirit, required the passage through knowledge and self-awareness. The serpent, in Hegel's reading, was an agent of historical necessity, the being that pushed humanity off the plateau of animal innocence and into the agonizing, magnificent climb toward genuine self-realization. This is not a fringe reading. It is a reading that has haunted Western philosophy, theology, and literature from Milton to Nietzsche, from Blake to Dostoevsky. John Milton, writing Paradise Lost in the 17th century, created a Satan so compelling, so eloquent, so philosophically formidable, that readers across 3 centuries have found themselves sympathizing with the wrong side. The Romantic poets went further. William Blake explicitly described the god of Genesis as a tyrant figure, whom he called Urizen, the god of law and limitation, and cast the serpentine force of rebellion as the source of genuine human energy and creativity. Percy Shelley called Milton's Satan the true hero of Paradise Lost. The Romantics understood that the story of forbidden knowledge is always, at some level, a political story, about who sets the limits of what is permissible to know and what happens when those limits are broken. Now let us consider what history actually shows us about the moments when forbidden knowledge broke through. Every major revolution in human understanding has followed the same pattern as Eden. An established authority declares that certain knowledge is off limits, that the world is a certain way and may not be questioned, that the boundaries of what is knowable are also the boundaries of what is permitted. And then someone crosses that line anyway, and everything changes. Copernicus and Galileo ate from the forbidden tree of heliocentrism in a world where the Church held the cosmos in its approved arrangement. The cost was profound. Exile, persecution, the condemnation of entire fields of inquiry as heresy. But the fruit could not be taken back. Darwin bit from the tree of natural selection in a world that had decided the origin of species was settled theology. The outcry was enormous, the accusations of blasphemy immediate and vehement. But the knowledge spread, and the world was changed. The history of human progress is the history of people eating from trees they were told were forbidden, and discovering that the fruit was not poison, but nourishment. In this sense, the serpent in Eden is not a mythological figure locked in the ancient past. It is an archetype that repeats itself across every generation and every culture. The serpent is every voice that asks the question authority does not want asked, every scientist who publishes a finding that overturns a received truth, every philosopher who argues that the foundations of the existing order are not natural law but constructed consent, every woman who was told her mind was not made for certain kinds of knowledge, every colonized people who were told their traditions contained nothing worth preserving, every human being who was handed a story about their own limitations and chose instead to think for themselves. The serpent speaks whenever someone decides that the authorized version of reality is worth questioning. The Orthodox response to this reading is important and must be taken seriously. From a traditional theological standpoint, the knowledge gained in Eden was not neutral. It was specifically the knowledge of good and evil, and the problem was not knowledge itself, but the manner of its acquisition in direct defiance of God's command, and with the result of corrupting the relationship between humanity and its creator. From this view, the serpent's gift was not liberation, but a lie wrapped in truth, technically accurate about the immediate effect, catastrophically silent about the ultimate cost. Death entered the world. Pain entered childbirth. The ground became cursed. Human relationships fractured. The paradise of unbroken communion with the divine was lost, and all of history since has been an attempt to recover what was thrown away in that moment of grasping. This argument has real force. There is something genuine in the observation that self-awareness, while it makes us human, also makes us capable of anxiety, alienation, cruelty, and despair in ways that are not available to beings without it. Consciousness is not only the source of art and love and moral courage, it is also the source of every atrocity ever committed with full knowledge and deliberate intent. The fruit does give exactly what the serpent promised, but the experience of knowing good and evil turns out to be an enormous and often unbearable burden. Whether that burden is worth bearing, whether it was worth the price, is a question every human being alive today is still, in some sense, answering with their life. But even this orthodox reading contains within it a quiet acknowledgement that the serpent's intervention was defining. The question is not whether the serpent changed humanity, it is whether that change was ultimately in humanity's interest. And this, perhaps, is where the deepest answer to our question lies, not in the yes or no of liberation, but in the nature of what was liberated, and at what cost, and whether the cost was the serpent's to impose or humanity's to bear. What we can say, with the evidence of thousands of years of myth, theology, philosophy, and history behind us, is this. Every tradition that has ever seriously grappled with the Eden story has recognized that something irreversible happened at that tree. A threshold was crossed. The serpent, whether cast as villain or hero, as devil or divine emissary, as tempter or teacher, was the agent of that crossing. Before the serpent spoke, humanity was contained. After it spoke, humanity was loose in history, capable of building cities and composing symphonies and committing genocides and falling in love and writing the very texts in which we argue about whether what happened was good or evil. The Ophites venerated the serpent because they believed the Demiurge's garden was a prison and the serpent was the one who opened the door. The Nasenas revered it as the embodiment of divine wisdom flowing through all creation. The Sumerian tradition encoded it in the figure of Enki, the god who chose humanity over hierarchy. The Greek tradition told the same story through Prometheus and called the act of giving forbidden knowledge to human beings an act of love. The philosophical tradition saw in it the necessary birth of self-consciousness. The literary tradition kept returning to it because it refused to be simplified, refused to resolve into a clean moral lesson, refused to be only one thing. And perhaps that is its deepest meaning. Perhaps the serpent in Eden is the first symbol of a truth so uncomfortable that every civilization has been forced to confront it in one form or another for as long as human beings have been telling stories. The truth is this: authority and freedom are in permanent tension. The consciousness that makes us human is also the consciousness that makes us ungovernable by those who would prefer us otherwise. Every system of power, theological, political, social, has an interest in setting limits on what people are permitted to know, to question, to imagine. And the serpent is the recurring figure that whispers across those limits, asking the question that authority dreads most. Did God, or the king, or the institution, or the tradition really say that? The serpent in Eden may not have been a liberator in the simple, triumphant sense of the word. The liberation it offered was not freedom from pain or consequence. It was freedom from a particular kind of ignorance, the ignorance of one's own condition. And that kind of freedom always comes with a price, always lands the recipient in a harder and more complicated world than the one they left. This is what makes Eden so enduring. It is not a story about paradise lost. It is a story about what it costs to become real. Thousands of years after those ancient Sumerian scribes first pressed the stories of Enki and Enlil into clay, after the Ophites were scattered and their books burned, after Prometheus was analyzed and allegorized and put on stages across the Western world, after Hegel wrote his philosophy of spirit, and Blake drew his visions of divine tyranny, the serpent is still coiled around the branch, still offering the fruit, still asking the question that has never stopped being asked. Was it a liberation? Every time a human being chooses knowledge over comfortable ignorance, every time someone refuses the story they were handed and goes looking for a truer one, every time consciousness expands into territory that the existing order has marked as forbidden, the answer in practice seems to be yes. The price is real. The exile is real. But so is the knowing. And in the end, the knowing is what we are made of.